It remains one of the unsolved mysteries of modern medicine. It's called schizophrenia. It can affect anybody regardless of intelligence or background at any age. To be schizophrenic is to feel your mind falling apart. Schizophrenics don't have a dual personality. They have bizarre thoughts and strange feelings. They may have a persecution complex, believe they're someone they're not, hear voices, see visions, use strange language, or refuse to speak. It is, in short, classical madness. What it is, and what causes it, is what the debate in modern psychiatry is about. Is it a physical illness where the brain is malfunctioning, or a genuine and comprehensible human experience resulting from painful emotional relationships? Mild schizophrenia, feelings of unreality, of being unloved, occasionally touches most of us, and any one of us can find themselves here in a mental hospital. And if we do, what will schizophrenia mean to us and to our doctors?
I think from a clinician's viewpoint, the easiest way to explain it is what one sees in actual patients. In fact, this is what Bloiler described in his now famous monograph in 1911, The Schizophrenias. He recognized that there was a number of patients who had a number of symptoms in common, and that these patients predominantly had a disorder of their thinking and of their feeling and of the way in which they perceived the world. In the normal person, one's thought is fairly coherent, as a steady stream of thought, as it were. But in the schizophrenic, this thought becomes disrupted, and the patient experiences thoughts being taken out of his mind, or the opposite, thoughts being inserted into his mind. He may have illusions, that is, he sees something and imagines it to be something else. Or he may have a hallucination. That's where he hears something when in fact there is not an auditory stimulus there. Now, if you're very sensitive about your situation, if you feel that other people are criticizing you or thinking badly of you, of course, you're immediately picking up all sorts of cues from the environment and mistaking people's comments for comments about you.
And I'll tell you why I was worried. I was worried that I was the center of all eyes, wherever I went.
You felt everyone was watching?
Yes, and everybody was watching me. Now I think I'm an absolute fool, but then I thought I was absolutely right.
So what did you do when you felt like this?
Well, when I felt like this, I used to put a bucket over my head. And this is the absolute truth, Doctor. Honestly, it makes you fall over backwards how grown-up people can behave just like children.
Yes.
But that is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God.
When you put the bucket on your head,
yes,
did it help?
Yes, because then I felt little more self-confidence coming into me, creeping into me, just because I had a bucket in my head and other people could see
As if
me.
it was giving you some privacy.
Giving me some privacy.
And this is what is the basis of the paranoia. This disturbance of one's feeling, after all, if one's not feeling right, if there's a disturbance of one's thinking, and if one's not reacting to one's environment in a normal way, one feels very frightened, and if one's frightened, one reacts by being hostile, by being suspicious. The other thing which people notice is that the feelings are incongruous. That means the feelings don't fit into the situation. Where people would normally be sad, the schizophrenic may show a certain jocularity.
I feel very happy, Doctor.
Is this a good happiness?
Well, I hope it is. As long as I keep it under control, don't let it get the better of me, control me, I'm all right.
Does it sometimes run away with you?
Well, I think I used to laugh sometimes when I had a bucket over my head, you know, and it was a different sort of laughter.
The feelings, on the other hand, are much more subtle things and not so easy to... But the classical situation, which is described, is that the patient appears to be flat. One says technically the affect is flat, meaning that one doesn't get any animation from the patient. He seems not to be responding to his environment.
I didn't quite, I was altogether in one place. I felt that I was almost dissolving, but I couldn't express this in words at all, these feelings. But I felt, you know, very bad there, as if I was absolutely stuck, and I seemed to be this physically. I seemed to get to a state of inability almost.
In the 17th century, delusions were taken seriously. The deluded were saints or witches, agents of God or the devil, and delusions were religious. Later, the mad seemed incomprehensible and threatening, and were injured and chained in the essence, and lunatics became more violent. In turn, enlightened Victorians regarded them as wretched and unfortunate, but still people to be locked up to protect society. This tradition carried on until after the last war, and some idea of hospital life then can be gathered from nurses like Eric Rains, who works here at Fulbourn.
They had nothing to do but walk around. Some was had to be carried out, and when they got there, they used to stand in one position and they wouldn't move. There were tremendous amount of noisy people. They were tormented by their hallucinations, and they would really shout. They would really let go for about half an hour, and then they'd be dead quiet. In every ward, you can at least say 10% of the patients were under lock and key. They were in individual rooms. They were counted out. They were counted in. They weren't allowed to have any personal property. It was just custodian care. Well, these poor souls that were princes, they were kings, they were dukes, nothing in the world would ever change them that they weren't. To see someone discharged in my early days here was a wonderful occasion.
Today, hospitals like Fulbourn have a liberal regime. The average stay for first admissions is about 4 to 6 weeks. This revolutionary change has been effected by therapeutic techniques, enlightened attitudes and new drugs. These drugs cure 10% and help 40% of patients.
My concentration was very poor, but it's very much better now.
What about your thinking?
My thinking is still inclined to go a bit higgledy-piggledy, but on the whole it's very much more quiet and concentrated.
Well, you don't usually feel the effects of them at all, not unless you do something strenuous or something, and then you realise you have the stroke for the drugs themselves.
Well, I do quite a lot. When I don't have the injection, I feel very miserable, you know.
In what sort of way?
Very low. You know, I just sort of seem like normally miserable, but get a lot bigger. And if you're not on the drugs or on the injections, you sort of drag you down during the day.
A lot of them haven't really made any difference at all. But the one I'm on at present seems to have made the most difference to me of all. I've felt better in the last fortnight since I've been having it than I have really since I can remember.
The drugs do have side effects, but the empty wards during the day bear witness to the usefulness of drugs, which are basically tranquilizers.
But they act in a much more subtle way than that. One of the physiological theories is the idea of arousal. But a schizophrenic person is in fact highly aroused. Now this flat appearance, which I've described to you, is simply a defense mechanism. It's a way of cutting off being over-aroused from the environment. And these drugs, the tranquilizers, act by putting, as it were, a blanket round the patient, so they don't become threatened or overwhelmed by the flood of information and feeling which is coming into them.
No one's sure how these drugs work. If we did know how and where they affected the patients, this would give research scientists a clue as to what causes schizophrenia, or at least the types of schizophrenia for which the drugs are effective. Scientists are able to make informed guesses.
One of the hunches, which is very popular, is that the drugs, such as the phenothiazines, which are nowadays used, interact in the brain with amine systems. Now, many people think of the brain, quite correctly, as a sort of computer, but in one important respect, the brain is different from a computer, in that the brain uses chemical signals as well as electrical signals.
In the brain, there are biochemical processes which are thought to involve perception and feeling, and might therefore be disordered in schizophrenia. We now have some idea how these amine systems work. Although one nerve cell or neuron stimulates the next nerve cell, there's always a gap between them. Near this gap, blood vessels supply fresh chemicals, an amino acid tyrosine, to the nerve, where it's converted through two transitional compounds into a chemical called noradrenaline. Brain activity consists of electrical impulses coming down the neuron, which pumps noradrenaline in bursts into the space between the nerve ending and the next neuron in the chain, which then interacts at the receptive site on the other neuron to trigger off the electrical firing of the second cell. After the burst of noradrenaline has been released, it's removed rapidly. If it weren't, it would keep exciting the second cell indefinitely. So it's either pumped back into the nerve terminal that released it, or it may get chemically degraded into inactive compounds which are washed away in the bloodstream. Some of them will eventually be excreted in the urine. This is one amine system in the brain. There are others. Could drugs be affecting these systems?
Classic drug for this, which has stimulated a great deal of research on these amine systems, and that drug is racipine. Racipine is in fact one of the first drugs ever used in the treatment of schizophrenia. And we know now that what it does to amine neurons is to knock out their ability to store a reserve supply of noradrenaline. It interacts in some way with these little storage particles, so that if racipine is given, noradrenaline disappears temporarily from the brain.
This rabbit is drugged with racipine. Its store of noradrenaline has been reduced. In the brain, tyrosine is converted into dopa, then into dopamine, and finally into noradrenaline. The rabbit's noradrenaline can be boosted by injecting dopa. The rabbit temporarily recovers. So, noradrenaline is involved in behavior and affected by racipine. Racipine helps schizophrenics, so could something be going wrong in their amine systems?
It's tempting to play a hunch here and say yes, mainly because of the similarity in structure between certain hallucinogenic drugs which produce symptoms in men rather similar in character to the schizophrenic syndrome, and naturally occurring amines. This is the substance we've been talking about already, noradrenaline, and we've seen its structure already. Here is, for comparison, one of the well-known hallucinogenic drugs, mescaline. And if you compare the structures of these two substances, you see that they have a certain basic similarity in their makeup. On the other hand, one could equally plausibly argue that hallucinogenic drugs are more related to another type of amine that one finds in the brain, an indolamine. Here is a hallucinogenic drug called psilocin, which is very similar indeed in structure to a naturally occurring amine called serotonin. In fact, if one removes these two groups on the nitrogen here from this hallucinogenic drug, one has the structure of the naturally occurring amine serotonin. And one could imagine quite plausibly that schizophrenia might be related to some abnormal chemical breakdown of the amines in the brain, leading to the production of substances like mescaline, which would produce the hallucinatory and other bizarre phenomena that one sees in the disease state.
If hallucinogens were produced here, abnormal waste products might be removed and turn up in the urine. In America, a compound very like mescaline has been reported in schizophrenic urine. Dr. Ridges in Liverpool, analysing urine by chromatography, where chemicals appear as coloured stains on sensitive paper, has found a pink spot in schizophrenics' urine, but not in normal people.
Our big problem at the moment is to find out the identity of the pink spot, which is now known to consist of a number of different components.
Does it seem that there's substances similar to mescaline on the one hand and things like adrenaline on the other?
Mm-hmm. Well, we think our results are highly suggestive of it being these sort of compounds. In fact, we're almost certain that these compounds are amines.
This work is controversial. Some researchers have found nothing. Others have found pink spots in normal urine. But urine studies, even if indirect clues, are the best we have. And the evidence, if tenuous, is suggestive. Brain chemicals crucially involved in thought and feeling look like some hallucinogens. The schizophrenic and hallucinogenic experience seem to be somewhat similar. If schizophrenics were producing hallucinogens in their brain, abnormal related chemicals might turn up in their urine. It's interesting too that chronic amphetamine addicts often show symptoms indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia, and amphetamine is chemically related to the hallucinogen mescaline. The brain chemical serotonin, which is similar to the hallucinogen psilocin, is crucially involved in dreaming, which can have schizophrenic characteristics. There are a number of hypotheses built around these and other suggestive connections. If schizophrenia is caused by a biochemical fault, that fault might be inherited. We know that schizophrenia tends to run in families.
And the easiest explanation, of course, is to say, well, this genetical material, this predisposing material, is handed on from one generation to another. On the other hand, we now know that very often what determines how people behave in families is not so much the genetical material, but the way in which the family conditions its members to behave. So it's very difficult to separate out genetical theory on the one hand and environmental theory on the other.
Research has tried to separate inheritance from environment. Are children driven mad by a schizophrenic environment, or do they simply inherit a faulty biochemistry? Evidence supports both views, but all kinds of factors intrude to blur the issue.
If in your family there's a trait, a characteristic, of course everyone's sweating, is it going to happen to me? And in a schizophrenic family, this anxiety will, of course, play on the person's emotions and on their feelings, and if you like, in a kind of way, drive them mad.
Occasionally in the womb, a single fertilized egg splits, and you get twins with an identical inheritance. If schizophrenia was simply inherited, one twin getting it should mean that the other does. If you take 10 pairs of identical twins where one is schizophrenic, only 3 of the others appear to succumb. This is obviously low for a simple genetic explanation, yet twice the rate for non-identical twins.
One doesn't necessarily disbelieve the twin evidence because one wants to talk in terms of environmental conditions. It's much less strong than it used to be. It's not all black and all white as it was once held to be. And I think most people nowadays would say, yes, there may well be some kind of predisposing factor, but this is not enough. It's perhaps necessary but not sufficient. And the environmental stresses are insufficient.
But what are these environmental factors? Doctors at Fulbourn visit patients in the bleak and windswept fens, where families are isolated and particularly close. On one visit with a social worker, the psychiatrist is discussing cases.
Remember the other girl, Angela? Remember that day she came into the clinic, terribly frightened?
Yes.
Crouching behind her father, auditorily hallucinated, quite terrified. And you and I took her into hospital that evening. Do you remember how within about 24 hours she settled down and it was quite normal?
Dramatic, quite dramatic, wasn't it, really?
Dramatic.
The change, yes.
No. Okay, coming into hospital must have something to do with it, but I think it's coming away from the family.
Yes.
Allowing the person to be free to be themselves.
Something strange is going on in the families of schizophrenics. One of the first people to investigate this was an American called Bateson. He pointed out that people don't only communicate with words, but with their face and their bodies. Look at these people. This one is interested, that one quizzical, this one bored, others intense or flirtatious. Bateson advanced the idea that the child is confused by parents who are saying one thing verbally but showing something else physically, and reported that schizophrenic mothers did this. For example, the mother says, "Come and kiss me, darling," but indicates visually that she doesn't want him to, dramatizing her desire to love but inability to do so. The child stops, and the mother says, "What's the matter, darling? Don't you love your mother?" Confronted with a whole complex of this kind of ambivalence, the child is literally driven mad. Other theories of this sort have been advanced.
But here, so the idea, the theory would run, the family is a very rigid one, with perhaps the mother of the family occupying a controlling position and not allowing people to explore with different sets of relationships, forcing a person, a child, into an unnatural, if you like, relationship, which is then intolerable.
I remember how when Diane first came to the clinic, she would hardly say a thing.
Yes.
And every time she opened her mouth, mother or father would say to her, "Now, don't interrupt," as if to imply that what she had to say was not important.
There was this overprotective attitude from mother and the tendency for her to rule the family, especially as father was somewhat crippled too.
Lyman Wynne and his associates, who talk about, if you like, an almost abnormally normal family, which superficially appears to be a very nice family, but on inspection is really too nice. And that this almost suggests that there's a kind of a quality about the family which is controlling the nastinesses, if you like. This is a rather naive way of putting it. But that it appears superficially to be nice, but that underneath there appears to be a good deal of unobserved and almost unacceptable nastiness. Now, in normal families, this doesn't happen. Normal families are nice and nasty, and the nastiness is allowed to come through and is expressed and is dealt with.
This kind of work is criticized as grand theory, based on small samples where the theorists see only what they're looking for.
It's difficult, again, to distinguish, is the family reacting in that way because the person is ill, or has the reaction, as it were, contributed to the person becoming ill? And studies of families, and in my outpatient work I try to interview quite a lot the parents and young people who have this disorder, to try and see how they relate to one another. Family therapy, in other words. And one can try to recreate what might be more helpful family situations, helping the schizophrenic patient to come to a better kind of decision about himself and dealing with his problems. How old's Carol now?
2.
Guess as long as that since she came back from the hospital. You had your christening up there, didn't you?
Yeah.
The parents in this family met and married at Fulbourn. The mother was schizophrenic.
But you've been in this house how long?
Just over a year.
Just a year. And before that, you were, of course, up in the caravan. And that must have been easier with the wee one.
That was awful.
Yes. What was the biggest
much
difference?
room.
There wasn't much room, yes.
No.
How else did you manage with hot water and things like that?
Well, I had the colour gas and just boiled water up on there.
But during your pregnancy, when you were carrying her, how did you feel?
Awful.
Did you?
Yeah.
But then you came through all right, and her birth was all right.
Yeah, but then she was a little after it, wasn't she?
Yes, and that worried you quite a lot. After all, if you spend a time in a hospital, in a sheltered environment, it's very difficult to go back out into the outside world. Perhaps if you've had a general illness, you know how long it does take to get used to coping with people again. Well, in the alienated world of schizophrenia, this sensitivity to other people is very marked. And so we make use of halfway houses. Well, it's a halfway step into full citizenship in the community outside. One has to get someone comfortable with themselves, and this is where one might use individual psychotherapy. But then you've got to help an individual to relate to others around him, and one will begin to use group therapy.
Well, people. I mean, I was frightened of going to work with a lot of people and seeing them.
Do you think they
And
were...
mixing
What were you afraid of?
large quantities of people.
What did you think they might do?
Well, I don't know, you was just frightened of them.
Does anybody else feel like that? Chris, how do you feel?
I find that it goes in series, you know. First of all, you feel frightened of going to work or going to see anyone, and then you get a little bit better. And when you get that little bit better, find yourself getting frightened of people again, you know.
How do you feel inside yourself?
Well, I feel that just a little bit cut off, you know, from speaking to people, you know.
Can you tell us what that feels like, being cut off?
Well, You can't concentrate, you know, and I find that talking to other people and being kind, you know, there's a great effort, you know.
I don't know if you ever experience feelings about your thoughts which were strange.
Yes.
I used to be afraid with my thinking that my heart might stop beating. I'd nowhere to go to, and I daren't cry or anything like that.
So you were afraid that you thought your heart might stop?
Yes. It was beating away to the dozen, and then it's just stopped. That's how it felt.
I came from a general hospital where I came here. And my people got me here because they could only come about once in 6 months.
Well, how will you feel, Dorothy, about leaving the hospital and going to the job?
Oh, I won't feel at all bad. I think I'll be able to do it. I work at therapy now. And of course, it's dead easy. There's nothing to it.
Of course, for many schizophrenics, the big problem is work. When their thought is broken up, they can't concentrate. And so a lot of our time is spent in industrial therapy, where the whole aim is to try to get the person back into a working situation. And the pay packet at the end of the week is quite a definite incentive.
So, environmental theory influences the hospitals, and the fact that treatment is effective indicates that social factors are crucial. Recent research has found some evidence that schizophrenic families contain a dominant parent, and that communication in normal families is much more chaotic than in schizophrenic families. It's also been shown that in London, male schizophrenics leaving hospital are more likely to break down if they return to their families, particularly if the family situation was an emotional one. Insight into schizophrenia might come in unexpected ways. Sometimes the hallucinations and feelings of schizophrenics seem dreamlike. Dr. Chris Evans draws analogies between the need of the brain to dream and the necessity of clearing old programs in computers.
You have, with computers at regular intervals, to perform certain operations on them which involve clearing old programs from them, and also updating and revising existing programs. In sleep, we come offline, to use a computer term, and the brain the brain is cut off from the outside world, and this process of running the old programs through and updating them and so on goes on. And this is what I think dreaming is. Now, I suspect that dream deprivation produces the effect of sort of clogging the system up and producing a backlog of old programs which have got to be cleared. And in due course, these will come to the fore while the person is awake, and then you'd get the kind of hallucinations that you get with sleep deprivation. Now, I think that one might expect, if dreaming was very important, that you could get malfunction of dreaming, and there would be a particular type of illness where this very important process wasn't operating properly. Now, I think it's quite possible that some of the schizophrenic conditions are caused by a malfunction of this dynamic dreaming process. And one of the symptoms would be an inability to distinguish between the interior material and the exterior material. One would experience one's dreams, if you like, while one was awake, and not be able to tell how real or how unreal they were.
Dreaming, LSD, schizophrenia, perception fragmented and sensibility acute. This is the stuff of art, the unusual connection, the strange perception. And the fragmentation of experience is what modern art's about. These cats were painted by Lewis Wayne as he became progressively schizophrenic. and many great artists, from Van Gogh to Tchaikovsky, were deeply disturbed. If schizophrenia is a thought disorder, great art is the reordering of conventional thought. The difference could be fine. It's an old idea that madness is akin to genius. In some families, madness and genius coexist. Perhaps then we should consider schizophrenia as a genuine human experience. That, like art, it's meaningful. David Cooper, a radical psychiatrist, thinks so.
I think schizophrenia is sheer creation, in fact. If you think of all the leading artists and poets that we most revere these days, Artaud, Gerard, Nerval, Hölderlin, William Blake, Coleridge, I think these are people who found a very discreet way of living out their madness, in fact. I think schizophrenics tend to be victimized because they're not skilled enough in social tactics and strategy to do this in a way that doesn't get them put away, locked up, and tranquilized.
This view is a radical departure. Madness is not what happens to a person, but what happens between people. Our behavior depends not only on what we want, but what other people expect. If schizophrenics live in disturbed families, they have to fit into false and rigid relationships. The sensitive find this difficult. He has to live up to the role the family have assigned him and suppress his own idea of himself. He can't contact those near him without being false to himself. Schizophrenia is not Jekyll and Hyde, but false self and real self. The mask is the false self, which the family need, but behind is the real self, stunted and cut off. As he acts out his false self, his family are happy, for that's how they want him. He's being something that he isn't. Imprisoned in a closed family world, his position is untenable. Going mad in this situation is saying what he really thinks and feels. He asserts his real self and says his family are trying to kill him, for example, meaning in a poetic sense they're not allowing him to be real. He's now refusing to play according to the family's rules in a game that's been destroying him. Once the rules have been challenged, the family can either examine the game that's disguising their own problems or call him mad. Threatened with a reappraisal of their own way of life, it's easier to choose the latter.
And I began to get worse. Till finally I had to taken away by my parents from my digs, because I was very ill then, you know. I had to come here.
My parents are getting more and more angry because I used to stay up half the night as well as the day, and I used to feel very active and talk a lot. And a mental welfare officer came. Mum said, "You're going to have to go for a car ride." I just had to drag me into the car to come, and I felt very angry, very bitter towards my parents, for I thought they were taking the wrong decision, taking responsibility from me to them.
Yes, I don't think my brother-in-law is going to forgive me how I used to behave before I first came in here. It's split right in two.
Is it because they put you in a hospital and they feel you're a bit different now that you're in a hospital and the situation changes then?
Cooper argues that the symptoms of madness are the first sign of health. His true self speaks. At last, he says what he feels. But because the real self is emaciated and fragile, he does so in gauche and bizarre ways. To suppress madness by drugs is to suppress the true self which needs to be developed. The real feelings of a crippled personality are now coming through in the delusions.
I think we have to find the truth of delusions, so-called, because the delusions are simply socially defined in a very arbitrary, very false way, I think. It's a matter of finding the truth of the delusion, not the falsity of it, and not trying to cure people of it.
Well, what about somebody who says they want to be buried?
I think there's probably a tentative in that case to achieve a state of death and then rebirth. I think this is essential to one's understanding of what psychotic breakdown means. It's always the attempt to achieve a proper death and proper rebirth. Disintegration, reintegration.
I haven't had a chance because I married young and I had a family of children and I had to rear them,
you see, and I've had no chance at all.
I think that most people can go through a so-called schizophrenic breakdown, go through the whole experience of madness and come out of it in a matter of a few months if they're not interfered with by these means. I think it's a matter of taking away the psychiatric interference and allowing people to live through their experience in a normal human context. And that's why I think mental hospitals should become just ordinary houses in the community where people can go through the experience, be accompanied by other people who understand enough, who aren't too frightened. They could come through at the other end in maybe 3 or 4 months. And that, in fact, happens in London today.
Here, in an old church hall, Cooper and his associates helped their patients live through their madness. Mary Barnes, once a chronic schizophrenic, talks about her experience here.
Well, here, it seemed that I was understood, that they understood what was happening. And they allowed me to go according to my own desires, but they helped me to understand it and to grow through it, rather than to sort of deny it and to push it away. And when I came here, I had the idea myself that I wanted to go back to before I was born and to come up again. Then, when I actually got here, I was so frightened, I forgot that, but they helped me to remember it and then to be what I felt, which was physically a baby.
Which is what psychosis is really about, you know, to destructure one's whole existence and then to restructure it again in a new and better way, to be renewed by the experience. I think what we really have to do is to revalue what's socially understood as madness in these terms, a renewal of oneself.
Well, in the beginning I wanted to be naked. Just used to put a black counterpane around me, and I was able to do this in my room and to wet the bed as I wanted. And it relieved me often in my feeling to lie in a wet bed, and also it relieved me when I wanted to put my sheets over me, so I was able to do this. And sometimes I go to sleep like it was a relief, and then I would be bathed, and I would be fed, and my desire was very much to suck then, and so I was fed with a bottle. I sucked a bottle, and I got to gradually laying still in the bed, and I seemed to almost be in a state of hibernation at one time, like as if I was a little animal going to sleep for the winter.
I think it's a matter of simply accompanying the person on the basis of one's experience of one's own madness. And that's always available to one, I think, although one refuses it all the time, denies it. I think it's a matter of the right accompaniment to the person, witnessing them and being with them through the experience, and doing that for weeks or months, whatever is necessary. Enjoying it, in fact.
I've sort of undergone an operation, mental as it were, in the sense that you speak of a physical operation, something that is a radical change, and I don't go according to the old sort of record or pattern that I'd got into, which was one of deception, because I'd denied very early in my life what I really felt, and I'd always had to pretend because of this thing that I'd made in myself in response to what I'd been up against when I was very small, and just seemed to unearth the real me. And although I felt very fragile at times about the house, I couldn't move if I felt other people were coming near me. Not Ronnie or Joe, but people I felt who didn't really understand, and I would keep quite still, and I felt I didn't want them to come in on me, and I didn't feel able to speak much with them. But Joe used to explain, well, I was speaking through my painting, and gradually I came more and more to have words and not to feel that I was going away on my words.
Many psychiatrists and scientists are skeptical about these ideas on the grounds that they've not been subjected to scientific scrutiny. To handle madness like this takes time, faith and compassion, and those who do are healers in the old-fashioned sense. Schizophrenia here is a mystical journey and a religious experience. Madness, in revolving around hallucinogens, dreaming, the mystical experience and the creative process, takes us into the world of fantasy, dreams, mysticism, the marvelous mystery of our own minds. As yet, there are no satisfactory answers, but the questions are enough. What can we learn from the schizophrenic experience? Is the schizophrenic's anguish the result of a diseased mind or the way we treat him? Is understanding schizophrenia the business of scientists or philosophers and priests?
The hypothesis would be that what's happening in schizophrenia is something abnormal in the breakdown of amine substances in the brain.
I used to hear this voice in my head saying, well, I've had enough of that and now I'm going to crucify and things like that.
Here is a family which can't allow conflict. The child finds this almost, so the theory would run, unbearable, and therefore withdraws, retreats, becomes autistic. This is in some senses then schizophrenic.
Because I felt fine, you know, I thought everybody else was wrong. And I was right. And so I resisted violently the idea of treatment.
I think the main thing that the schizophrenic suffers from is alienation.
Well, the trouble was there was nobody to talk to me. So I felt all the time I was all alone and nobody wanted to have anything to do with somebody who's so silly.
I think we're terrified of love, of living out progressively all our fantasies and dreams, in fact, of having our dreams. But above all, we're terrified of love. I think love is what schizophrenics are after.